Hello, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. As you all trickle in, I'll introduce myself. I'm Sonja Kelly. I direct research at Women's World Banking across our global portfolio alongside our incredible research team, some of whom worked on some of what we'll share today. Hi, welcome. It's so great to see these names coming in. Welcome everyone. I'd like to make a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Please note that this event is being recorded. You'll notice that everyone's mics are muted and cameras are off, and this is intentional to keep the focus on our speakers today. But that doesn't mean we don't want you to participate. If you have something you want to ask the panel we have or that you want to share, please do so by going to the Q&A button on your Zoom platform or making a note in the chat. We have some moderators standing by who will introduce themselves, and we want this to be an interactive session even though we have everybody muted. We just ask that as you participate, please keep the chat and questions respectful and on topic. If you do experience any technical issues today, please feel free to reach out to the email that you see on the slide at the bottom of the slide here. And I'll say that email in case you don't see the slide. The email is ca@womensworldbanking.org, and we have somebody standing by who can answer those questions. Before we get started, I'd love to take a minute and learn a bit more about each of you so that we can keep the unique perspective of our audience in mind as we proceed with this session. So we're going to put a couple of polls up on the screen so that you can share with us who you are and where you are joining from. So right now you should see two questions on your screen. One says, where are you joining from? The second says, what industry or stakeholder type are you? I think you have to do both of the questions and submit them before we are able to log them. So looks like the votes are coming in here. 50% of you have been able to participate in the survey so far. So that's fantastic. It also means you're paying attention, which is great. So yeah, so I'm gonna keep it open for just a little bit longer because it looks like a lot of you are still making your selections. And fantastic. Oh, I can't wait to show you the results of this poll. This is a really nice diversity, a really nice mix of people. And this will be, yeah, I think a great set of people to talk with, because I think that this topic has relevance across these stakeholder types and geographies. So let's go ahead and share the results from that poll. Looks like most people are joining us from North America, but very close behind Sub-Saharan Africa. And then Asia, thank you so much for joining us and good evening to you. I'm always impressed with people who take these calls and webinars outside of working hours. And then in terms of industry or stakeholder type, I think this will be of great interest to our panel because we do have a really nice diversity: NGOs, financial services providers, government, individuals. Fantastic. Well, thank you and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I see as well some of you taking the opportunity to say hello in the chat. Welcome to all of you. Welcome Lynn and Raida. And Rekha, great to have you all here today. So I'd love to turn to my colleague Harsha Rodrigues now to kick off our conversation and provide some framing comments. Harsha.
Thank you, Sonja. And hello, everyone, and welcome to this, our second Making Finance Work for Women webinar. My name is Harsha Rodrigues, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer and Head of Advisory Services at Women's World Banking. For those of you who may not know us, we are a 42-year-old global nonprofit that has been working to empower low-income women around the world by giving them the financial tools and resources they need to build their security, prosperity, and resilience. If you're joining us for the first time, a warm welcome to you. We're delighted to have you here. And for those of you who know us and have been to one of our events or webinars before, we're thrilled you could join us again. Thank you for your continued support. Just a little context before we start. Women's World Banking has been convening the development community, policymakers, and financial service providers who have an interest in serving low-income women for a number of years via our biannual flagship event, Making Finance Work for Women. The pandemic and its impact on women has only highlighted the need to increase our collective efforts. And so this year, we decided to take MFWW virtual and convene on important topics more regularly. Last month, we discussed the importance of digital financial capability building to help women access digital financial services more effectively. A regulator friend once remarked to me, "Cash is king, but digital is divine." So this month, we are staying on the digital theme and looking at digital platforms that we think have tremendous potential to bring more women into the formal system, helping them access and use finance to grow their businesses. Our discussion today will explore the ways in which e-commerce and social commerce, supported by digital literacy and digital marketing, could serve as on-ramps to financial inclusion for women-owned and women-led MSMEs. In our own research in markets like India, Indonesia, and Mexico, we've seen a proliferation of digital platforms that women entrepreneurs are using and adopting with enthusiasm. We see women using platforms like Facebook, WhatsApp, Gojek, as well as bank-developed e-commerce platforms and other social channels for all their business interactions, from marketing their products to connecting to customers, ordering stock, and even haggling on prices. But we have also noticed that when it comes to payment, even though orders are placed online, cash on delivery is often the norm. Cash payments are still predominant, including asking friends or family to cash out at an agent or a convenience store. Some of the questions we will be asking our panelists today will be around this dynamic. Why are women adopting digital platforms so enthusiastically, but shying away from digital transactions? Is it an issue of trust? Is it low levels of literacy and numeracy that result in the lack of confidence in being able to independently perform financial transactions? How can we build the support systems needed to enhance customer experiences when it comes to digital transactions? Ultimately, we want to explore how digital platforms can foster greater agency among women users and lead to greater economic empowerment. Much of our discussion will pull from a paper we're about to release with the generous support of WhatsApp Facebook, which looks at social commerce in Mexico and builds off our previous research on the topic in India and Indonesia. I'm looking forward to all your questions and comments in the chat throughout the session. We're also very happy to take any feedback or suggestions you might have for future events. In closing, I would like to thank our sponsors and supporters. Making finance work for women cannot happen without their generous contributions. And so I would like to thank our advancing sponsor, Ernst & Young, our broadening sponsors, the European Investment Bank, Boston Consulting Group, Facebook, and the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, and our supporting sponsors, Diebold, Nixdorf, and Art Financial Group, for their generosity in helping us create this platform. I would also like to thank our friends FinEquity as our contributing partner for amplifying these discussions to an even wider audience. And finally, I would like to extend a special thank you to Women's World Banking's co-funders, Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT, the Swedish International Development Agency, SIDA, and the Visa Foundation for their ongoing support of our work. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Sonja. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Harsha. Indeed, as Harsha shared, we're thrilled to be tackling this question of how digital platforms might usher in digital financial services for low-income women entrepreneurs. And it's a topic that the industry has been thinking about for a number of years now. As Harsha shared, the rise of Facebook, Alphabet, Twitter, WhatsApp, Amazon, Alibaba, Harsha also mentioned Gojek, and others have ushered in this new age of digital engagement and digital capability. And while the financial sector has been watching this rise with interest, the global pandemic accelerated digital adoption. We've seen in our research across the world that with national lockdowns and fear of engaging in person, you and me and the rest of the world changed our engagement habits if we were able to, shifting to digital commerce and relationship building over digital platforms. I'm going to share some insights on this trend and the potential it provides for financial services to offer valuable tools to entrepreneurs, especially women. And then we're going to shift to a panel discussion, which is what I think of as the centerpiece of this event, with Caribou Digital, CGAP, Diebold, Nixdorf, and Facebook sharing their own insights on the opportunities and also the challenges of leveraging digital platforms for financial inclusion. Along the way, I'd love for you, as I shared when we first started, to be thinking about questions, and please be willing to provide insights into the questions and topics that we raise here today. We do have the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen where you can submit a question for consideration. And we also have the chat function through which you can interact with my colleagues, Jacqueline and Gerardo, and I encourage you to use those liberally. So turning back to the topic, I want to highlight the opportunity that platforms have. A couple years ago, Women's World Banking, with funding from Standard Chartered and the Australian Government Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, looked at the social commerce and e-commerce opportunities for women entrepreneurs in India and Indonesia. And at that point, we were just trying to wrap our heads around this trend of women entrepreneurs' engagement with social media and social commerce and hear how they felt about it. And at that point, we thought it was a foregone conclusion that social commerce and e-commerce platforms would naturally evolve to include a large portion of their users engaging in digital payments. And in fact, our report recommendations at that time focused a lot of attention on credit in lieu of payments, since we thought payments would be too easy and were just like a natural conclusion. Fast forward to today, post-pandemic, we still see women picking up digital tools across financial and social commerce platforms. Excuse me. And the pandemic certainly accelerated this adoption. But these digital platforms are not naturally translating into digital financial services use. So with funding from Facebook, we just finished a user research project in which we assessed the financial services needs of women entrepreneurs in Mexico and co-created with them ideas for solutions that might meet these needs. We were pretty astounded at the gap between need and adoption. The survey was with about 40 entrepreneurs. It was a new way of working for me and for Women's World Banking, driven by the fact that we couldn't travel far from our own homes as researchers. So both our researchers in Mexico City and our researchers in New York and Washington, DC, instead of being able to go to and participate in interviews, we had to find another way to do this. So rather than shift to a completely phone-based model, we partnered with local anthropologists to collect data from their own communities, interviewing women and men entrepreneurs in some cases who were working with them, who were catalog sellers, shopkeepers, and food vendors. And we wanted to make sure that all of those were women-led or women-owned businesses. I'm not going to go into the distinctions here. I don't think that's terribly important, but keep in mind that the focus here was on women. And these are women that the anthropologists knew personally and engaged with regularly. So the responses we received from these women, not only were they more COVID safe and COVID friendly, just because we were able to adapt to and comply with very local COVID restrictions, but also we found that we got more candid and genuine responses from the women entrepreneurs than we expected to. And over the course of sometimes hours, the anthropologists would observe their day-to-day activities. Maybe the anthropologist would be sitting outside of the shop. They would discuss the financial and digital aspects of their business with the entrepreneur as she had availability, would take notes on the surroundings, observe customer interactions, talk with her about how she was using her digital life at her business site, or how she was using her digital tools at her business site. And the result was a rich tapestry of stories and insights on women's both digital and digital financial and non-digital financial lives. Before I jump into some of the findings of this work, I wanted to highlight a representative story of one of the entrepreneurs that we interviewed. Let's call her Nora. Nora sells goods through a catalog to her neighbors. And with the pandemic, she shifted from in-home consultations to WhatsApp conversations. She would advertise, set prices, negotiate, and agree to a sale. She would agree to a delivery method and a delivery date and location on the platform. But when it came to paying, Nora would send her 17-digit account number to her customer through the digital platform, and then ask her customer to go to their local convenience store. In this case, in Nora's case, it was an OXXO in Mexico, and deposit the payment into Nora's account by giving the 17-digit number to the cashier along with the cash. Nora's customer would then have to take a photograph using her or his mobile phone and text the photo to Nora to confirm that the payment was made to the right account. Now, this was incredible to me because it wasn't a cash-based transaction. It was a transaction using a direct deposit into a bank account, but it was tremendously inefficient. And knowing what other possibilities are out there in Mexico, this provided a bit of a puzzle. And Nora was not alone. Digital finance has perplexingly not caught up to the widespread and accelerated adoption of digital channels for other activities. And today we'll talk a little bit about why, both in my presentation of this research and also in the panel. I'll frame my discussion or my comments by talking about women's unique needs, and then shift to sharing the results of that co-creation process that I mentioned that we had with select women entrepreneurs across the spectrum of business types and degree of digitization. And then we'll conclude with this discussion of what the next steps are for financial services providers and platforms alike. So first, women customers' needs. Women's financial needs align with every step of her entrepreneurship journey. And in this slide, you'll see both the digital engagement and the financial engagement of women entrepreneurs in each step in their payment cycle. Currently, women entrepreneurs we talked with are assembling a range of payment mechanisms for meeting their financial services needs, taking payments, making payments, saving, reinvesting in their businesses, paying themselves. They market their products, they make the sale, they receive payments, manage their money, pay suppliers, pay expenses, and save or reinvest. And they do these things through cash, bank transfer, remote deposit, ATMs, credit cards, credit account management. And you'll see on this slide a teaser. We, at the top left, 3 personas, and I'll share a little bit more about those personas, but we mapped each of these personas onto different activities, and I'll get to that in a minute. But first I wanted to share another story, actually. This is Eleni. She's a 54-year-old shopkeeper in the suburbs outside of Mexico City, and she told us, people send us their list by WhatsApp. She was in a convenience store, the pandemic hit, and her customers, instead of coming in, engaged with her on WhatsApp, shared their grocery list. She then took it, and then she would deliver the goods to their doorstep. But instead of leaving the goods on their doorstep and walking away, Eleni instead had to do a cash transaction. And this was complicated in the pandemic, as you can imagine, because she had to make change and she wasn't at her business location. So she would ask first over WhatsApp, how are you planning to pay me, in what denominations of the currency? And then she'd have to bring the change with her. She said it was pretty awkward because in addition to running her business, she was also managing this cash. And that's a whole different layer. So Eleni is part of a group of people who are comfortable with digital technology. She's actively using WhatsApp to take orders for her business, to tell people what the price is, to talk about the financial piece of the business. But when it comes to financial services, she's still using cash. And she told us that she was waiting for her customers to ask to use digital financial services before she fully adopted them. You can also see in this picture that it says in a sticker at the bottom of the photo, I accept all cards using Clip, which is a card acceptance technology. But her customers aren't widely asking for using cards, and so she's a little bit ambivalent about that. And we called Aurelie and people like her growing digitizers. You can see this in this number 2 persona as part of the persona map we put together, and I'll explain this persona map. You can see in terms of her independence or dependence on other people as part of her technology use. We map people on whether they were using technology alone or whether they were relying on others. And the independent is there at the top, and dependent is there at the bottom on the y-axis. And then if you look at the x-axis that goes across the screen, we charted people who are primarily taking cash-based payments on one side against those who are taking digital payments on the other side. And we mapped out where people fit in this XY axis. So the first group was cash-based entrepreneurs who are dependent on other people for their technology use. These are people who only interact in cash or primarily in cash, and then also their digital technology, like their digital use, is mitigated by other people. And so they rely on their nephew or their spouse or some trusted member of their community to engage digitally. These growing digitizers are people who still rely on other people for their digital lives, but are starting to think about accepting transfers and cards. And then you see here in the top right, we called them our adventurous technistas, people who are independent and making transactions on their own, and also are using digital. We see the greatest potential for change here in this growing digitizers group, but I'll talk a little bit more about what some of the sticking points are that are keeping them from growing. So obviously, I should mention as well, this is just one way of typifying entrepreneurs on one set of axes. In fact, you might hear from other panelists other ways of thinking about different kinds of customers, and I'm looking forward to that discussion. But this typology does give us some language to point out differences between people in regards to their comfort with digital and their preference for cash. So I'd like to show you some examples of what our interviews with each of these people from each of these categories tell us about them. And these specifically are some quotes from a representative person from each of these groups. So another Nora, cash-based entrepreneur, says, I go to the market and get most of my supplies. They only take cash there. The rest of my supplies, we get it from a supermarket. My husband pays with his card because of the loyalty program where they give us cash back, but it's just a little money where we spend there. Mostly it's just the regular market with my own cash. And this is obviously part of her supplier relationship. I thought it was interesting that she is familiar with and somebody close to her is using a card to make payments, but it's her husband's card and his loyalty program. And which is, we were debating between whether to categorize her as cash-based or a growing digitizer, but we thought she was more close to the cash-based because it was somebody else who was using the card. And then growing digitizer at a point a little bit further along. I go to make deposits at a Banco Azteca branch. I have the account number of the person I'm paying written down. So I go to the ATM to withdraw my cash and then to the bank branch to make the deposit. This is Aurelie, who you saw before. She is using financial services, formal financial services, but in a slightly inefficient way, because because she's going and making the deposit at the ATM, and then she goes to the bank branch to make the, she goes to the ATM to withdraw the cash, then she goes to the bank branch to make the deposit. And then moving a little bit further along the line to the adventurous technistas. One thing that we saw, and this is very common among people of all income levels, of all levels of digitization and financial sector engagement, we know that everybody has different mental accounting with different channels. And we saw this with the adventurous technistas. Yolanda said, what I have is digital money. I can't see it directly. I cannot touch it. I cannot spend it so easily. So it helps me to have savings. And so she liked that separation she had. I let my account slowly fill as I receive payments from customers. And I constantly check how much I have so I can keep control of my finances. And so she's using digital finances in a different way. So what does this mean in terms of leveraging digital platforms for financial inclusion as we think about what financial services might look like in response to these customer needs? So like I said, we conducted co-creation sessions with some of our women entrepreneurs, 12 of them, and this is what they came up with as an ideal payment solution. They wanted something that integrated with the social channels that they already have. So let me pause for a minute and make a footnote, which is that we were very sensitive throughout this research to the fact that it was a Facebook funded project. And we really looked hard for ways that women entrepreneurs were engaging in digital channels outside of Facebook and WhatsApp. Inside our sample, there were none. Everybody was using WhatsApp for customer engagement, specifically marketing and communication, and Facebook for broader broadcasting of their products. So the women we talked with wanted to use these same interfaces that they were using and channels they were already comfortable with, not primarily for the convenience of it, but because they wanted to be sure they had a basic level of understanding about the platform before they risked their financial lives. They wanted to be able to trust their services, and they wanted it to be something that everybody else was using as well. So integrating payment functionality into the platforms in which they were already engaging just seemed to make sense to them. So the women we talked with had certain requests of what an interface might look like. They wanted to be able to check their balance, to select a payment, to make the payment, to put in an amount, and for that to be very easy. They wanted to have some kind of a security feature, and they wanted a payment notification. And some of the things that were important to them as user benefits that we used as design principles as we engaged in this process was those with a high degree of literacy wanted to be able to envision themselves trusting services by the look and feel being a look and feel they were already familiar with. They wanted immediate and reliable customer support. They wanted some kind of completion confirmation. And in fact, this was the greatest felt need because of that confirmation feeling of cash, having cash in your hand, that they were already, some of them were already recreating through what I shared at the beginning, that photograph of the receipt of the customer who engaged with the OXXO. So they wanted to recreate that confirmation of cash. They wanted to maintain customer information and transaction history as kind of a record keeping for themselves. And they could see the potential for increased sales due to digital, and we're getting excited about the possibility of an interface like this, but they felt that the potential had to be strong enough to overcome their concerns, and that was an issue with them, that they needed to be compelled to use it greater than their concerns. Okay, so I think I've talked enough about the topic and hopefully grounded it in a particular context. Now we're going to zoom back out to the bigger question, global question of how digital platforms might be leveraged for financial inclusion, to talk very practically about like what the first step would be. I'm going to introduce our panel. We have Julie Hogan from Diebold Nixdorf, Jonathan Donner from Caribou Digital, Yasmin Bin-Humam from CGAP, and then Yana Sobral Alvarez from Facebook Financial. And I'll invite you all to turn on your videos. Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, all of you. This is great. And I hope you've been, the panelists have been watching the chat, which I haven't been able to keep an eye on, and the questions that have come in as well. And I would guess we have a lot to talk about. But let me start by inviting you in the order in which I introduced you to share a little bit about where your work is focused along the digital platform and digital finance customer journey. So Julie, why don't I turn to you first?
Great, thanks everybody. Hope you're having a fantastic day, and I'm so pleased to be here, and thanks for the invitation. I'm Julie Hogan, I work at Diebold Nixdorf, and our area of focus right now on this topic is bridging the gap between the physical and digital worlds. Obviously, we are very focused on supporting the financial institutions and helping them serve their customers. So addressing access and inclusion for differently abled populations is important. Strengthening our mix of physical and digital channels to serve the different needs, and expanding our payments platform to handle more transaction types. So my role at Diebold is I'm responsible for the banking solutions portfolio, all of our offerings and how they all fit together from a hardware, software, and services perspective, as well as designing our solutions and onboarding our solutions and governing those processes. I've been here about 18 months and I come from different industries, and I'm thrilled to be here to help make sure we're thinking of every way and every constituency that we should serve. So thanks for the invite.
Thanks, and over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Sonja, and thanks, Julie, and thanks, everybody. What a great opportunity to have this conversation. I'm also thrilled to be here. My name is Jonathan Donner. I'm the research director at a research consultancy called Caribou Digital. Our focus is on helping others and our clients build more inclusive digital economies all around the world, but with a particular focus on the global south and emerging markets. In that vein, we've done a number of studies over the years in kind of what we'd call the DFS kind of arena. But lately, I think the conversation is sort of shifting a little bit, or getting more expansive as this particular conversation kind of illustrates. So we're looking at livelihoods. And I think some of the research that we've been doing lately has been about kind of what does a digital livelihood look like, and what does a digitally enabled platform livelihood look like. And so that's, I guess, where I'm sitting, and we'll be sharing some thoughts on today about where I sit on that sort of customer journey, is really thinking about this as a livelihood. And we've got a couple kind of takes on that, which I guess I can share later. But again, it's just a pleasure to be here.
Welcome, Jonathan. Great. Over to Yasmin.
Thanks, Sonja. My name is Yasmin Bin-Humam, everyone. I'm a financial sector specialist focusing on women's financial inclusion at CGAP, which is the consultative group to assist the poor, housed within the World Bank. And in that role, I am the program manager for Finequity, which Harsha mentioned in the introduction. It's a global community of practice on women's financial inclusion. And we've been looking at digitally enabled financial inclusion for women at a kind of higher level across different stakeholders. What are the needs? What are the roles? What are the barriers? Higher level questions like that over the past 5 years. Also at CGAP, I've been conducting and leading various research programs, most recently, very similar to what Sonja presented, Women's World Banking has done in Mexico. We did a study across Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, a qualitative study with women entrepreneurs who were using social media platforms such as Facebook and WhatsApp to conduct commerce. And I'm happy to speak to some of those findings later on during the panel. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thanks, Yasmin. And over to you, Yana.
Hello, everyone. Such an honor to be here in this panel today, talking about such an important topic. So my name is Yana Dumaresque. I am the Latin America Director for Public Policy at Facebook Financial. That is the umbrella under which we consolidate Facebook's payments and financial products together. As some of you may know, Facebook, through all its digital platforms, Instagram, WhatsApp, Facebook, Messenger, has the mission to give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together. And Facebook Financial, or F2 as we call it, was created last year, aligned to this mission to make the financial world accessible to all. Today, with over 3.4 billion people using one or more of our apps every month, and over 200 million businesses using our tools, we see ourselves as uniquely positioned to connect the world through payments and financial services. So we in F2 work in this exact area where digital platforms and financial services overlap. Our job is to offer tools, products, services, and experiences that translate this unique positioning into more financial inclusion, more entrepreneurship, and more empowerment. So I'll be very happy to share with you some thoughts throughout the panel.
Great, thank you so much, Yana. So I've been focusing on the customer perspective. Let's shift now to the provider and platform perspective. There are a lot of us in the financial inclusion community who have been pointing out the inclusion opportunity that e-commerce and social commerce present. Are e-commerce and social commerce players seeing the same opportunities? I'd love to first kick it to Jonathan.
I think e-commerce and social commerce players are seeing the same opportunity that we in the financial inclusion and digital development communities may be seeing. But I think they see it differently, and they see it differently from each other. So e-commerce and the social commerce platforms may not see it in exactly the same way. And by that, I mean, sometimes we use the terms kind of independently, like anybody who's using a platform is doing e-commerce. And in some sense, that is true. But the sort of the social commerce end of that kind of digital commerce spectrum looks pretty different than the e-commerce spectrum. And by e-commerce, I mean something like Jumia or Amazon or Mercado Libre, or things that are more sort of full service hosted marketplaces where somebody sits in the middle and facilitates exchange of goods and services. Those providers do a lot of they do escrow, or they do ratings, and they build trust. Maybe they have a fleet of trucks. They have specialized tools that present products and do inventory control and dynamic pricing, and just a whole bunch of things you need to do with like 20 years of work to kind of make those e-commerce marketplaces work for small scale sellers. And so they're kind of reaching kind of out more broadly to facilitate kind of more folks on those platforms, smaller scale, what we would call micro enterprises, can start to join those programs and do pretty well. Then on the other kind of side of that, you have what social commerce platforms are doing. And social media companies are primarily about anything that people want to do and anything that people want to talk about, whether it is talking about a movie they've seen, or sharing their wedding photos, or selling their products, right? And so people have been using kind of very personalized and personal tools in very organic ways to run small businesses. And so I think a social commerce platform, may see the opportunity differently and may present to its would-be users kind of a different set of tools. But what's actually happening is they're kind of meeting in the middle, right? And there's, I think, a choice happening. Sonja, you mentioned this too, about in that sample in Mexico, almost everybody so far in that sort of segment that I think Women's World Banking and a lot of us on this call would be really concerned about, kind of real micro entrepreneurs and solo entrepreneurs and women-led businesses. are meeting their users where they are, they're meeting their customers where they are, and they want to be doing this inside of, you know, Facebook and WhatsApp and the other kind of social commerce platforms. So I'll stop this here by just saying it's going to be a welcome burst of innovation and contestation, and people trying to innovate to figure out what the best way to serve that customer set is. But again, the sort of this e-commerce businesses and the social commerce businesses may be reaching it in different ways.
Oh, you're muted, Sonja.
Thank you. That's the first time that's happened to me today, but I'm sure it's not the last. Yeah, I really appreciate that defining of stakeholders there are here and what the different incentives and entry points they might have are, because we're talking about both, but separating them out and saying what's the difference between the two, I think is really important. Yasmin, let me turn to you. Do you see, are these players seeing the same opportunities that the financial inclusion space has been pointing out?
Yeah, you know, on the topic of defining our terms, I think e-commerce platforms, and Jonathan, you mentioned a few, these are the integrated online platforms where, you know, they do marketing, they determine, you know, you make a selection, do you want to do cash on delivery, do you want to pay online, you know, they organize for the delivery and whatnot. But we've been using the term social commerce platform. And actually, the way we at CGAP have been looking at it is that's not a term that we've used and defined. There are social media platforms, right? The Facebooks, the WhatsApps, the Instagrams, the Vibers, those kinds of things. And people conduct social commerce on them, right? And in fact, we define it as informal online commerce, because the social commerce can also be done by people using formal e-commerce platforms, right? We see it as largely around marketing, right? This is the value add that the social media platforms are providing to the commercial process of the entrepreneurs that we interviewed. And I think that, and I'm sure Jana will speak to this as well, the opportunity that they've capitalized on so far, the social media platforms, is marketing, right? Is visibility. And now they are moving into that payments space, that financial space. They see the opportunity, but it's still very, very nascent, as we can see. The formal e-commerce platforms are way ahead of that. So they've seen the opportunity in marketing, you know, they've jumped on it. People are leveraging it. They're seeing the opportunity in the financial sector, but it's a lot slow. It's slow going there for many, many different reasons, which I'm sure Jana can touch on. I'll just add that I think from a financial service perspective, the users we interviewed, and this differs slightly from what you presented, I don't think that they have that kind of loyalty to the social media platform that would necessarily be their financial service provider. They may or may not already have a financial service provider, be it digital or not digital, you know, who they have a relationship with. And I think that's more where the loyalties and the relationships lie for you know, financial development.
I mean, I think it's time to turn to Jana because that just seems like the natural next place to go. And Jana, I'll set you up with a question, but you can feel free to respond to that as well if you want to. But my question might get you there as well, which is, and this, I'm happy to let this spark a bit of a debate in our panel, but are digital platforms better positioned than traditional financial institutions to advance the financial inclusion of women entrepreneurs? And if so, how, in what ways?
Thank you, Sonja. Thank you, Yasmin. I think that I can, first of all, come back to Yasmin's point, and I agree with her. This is a pretty nascent movement. And I think that perhaps one of the reasons why this is still a nascent movement is because as a company, Facebook was very much acquainted with low regulated environments. Social media is a pretty nascent industry as well. And when we decide to move forward to enter into the financial services ecosystem, this is a pretty heavily regulated space. So there is also a learning curve for the company and for stakeholders inside this ecosystem to learn and to be prepared to enter and to offer solutions into this new world. Now, back to Sonja's point on, are we as digital platforms better positioned than the traditional industry to offer financial services to emerging economies or to Latin America or Mexico, as the report was mentioning? I mean, first of all, I think that financial inclusion, especially in Latin America, is not a matter of either or. We need all the players, banks, fintechs, digital platforms, all of them together to overcome this challenge. As you know, more than half of the population in Mexico is financially excluded. And this is, in general terms, the reality of Latin America, and I'm sure to some extent also the reality faced in other emerging economies. Among households at the bottom 40% of the income distribution, roughly 3/4 of adults were unbanked in 2017, for example. So the gap between those with access and those on the outside of the financial system is exacerbated for women and other minorities. Moreover, half of Mexico's GDP is generated by micro, small, and medium enterprises, and half of those are women-owned or women-led. So in other words, women's ability to successfully operate their businesses is essential to a complete economic recovery and future economic growth. But it's also very important to understand who are the women we are talking about. So according to, let's stick to the Mexico example. According to UN data, in 2019, 20.7% of women under 18 years were married or in a union. 27% of women's time was spent on unpaid domestic service or care work. 37% of female adults were living in a severe food insecurity context. But on the other hand, the number of individuals of any age who own at least one smartphone and use at least once per month this smartphone in Mexico progressed in a much faster pace than any other traditional service. Only during the last year, more than 5 million users were added to the digital space in Mexico through having a smartphone. So it is very clear that digital platforms are able to reach in a more efficient way those who, for a variety of reasons, were not seen or not captured by the traditional financial system. Digital payments and mobile-based payments specifically, as the report showed, have the potential to advance financial inclusion in emerging economies. And our role, as I said before, our role in F2 is to offer tools that translate this unique positioning into more inclusion and more empowerment.
Thanks, Yana. I think this is a great opportunity to put up a quiz question. Yana did a really nice job of articulating and quantifying the market opportunity and some of the environment and connectivity numbers here. And so we have another one that we'll put up here as a poll. How many people in the world have an active WhatsApp account? And there is a right answer here. So go ahead and make a choice. If you're multitasking, you should have seen a window pop up for you either in the bottom of your screen or possibly it came in front of your whatever you're doing. It looks like Great. We have about 50 people who've already voted here. This is great. And then the second question is, what proportion of unbanked adults have a mobile phone? Without Googling, see if you can figure out what that answer is. So we've got the results coming in here. Fantastic. Okay, the votes are still coming in, so I'm going to leave it open. How many people in the world have an active WhatsApp account, and what proportion of unbanked adults have a mobile phone? We're still voting here. Okay, votes are starting to slow down, so I'm going to give you 5 seconds, and then I'm going to go ahead and close it. A few more coming in. Okay, let's go ahead and close this quiz, of which there is actually a right answer. Panelists, Jana, can you give us the answer to that first one? Oh, you're on mute.
The first one is 2 billion.
That's right. And you also mentioned another number at the beginning that I wanted to highlight, and that was 3.2 billion people have
all apps,
have some kind of app that's a Facebook or WhatsApp related app.
Facebook, Instagram, Messenger, WhatsApp.
Yeah. And then for all of the panelists, who wants to jump in, what proportion of unbanked adults have a mobile phone? Yeah,
I'll jump in. That is 60% of unbanked adults have a mobile phone, but I think the number might be lower if we go to unbanked women.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, very true. And I didn't look up that number in preparation for this quiz, but that's an excellent point. And so these are a couple other numbers that show the market opportunity here. The percent of people in the world who have an active WhatsApp account that came directly from Facebook, and the proportion of unbanked adults who have a mobile phone came from the World Bank Global Findex data. It's a 2017 number. I expect that to go up when the Findex, World Bank Global Findex numbers are released for the most recent survey. So let's take that survey down, and I'd love to turn to Julie now. Julie, with Diebold Nixdorf, you rely on both digital and also in-person kind of human-mediated transactions, and I'd love to hear about, like, as we think about the future of finance, how much do you see customers relying on a fully digital space, and how much do you see them engaging, like wanting to have some kind of human touch or physical cash, or like, tell me a little bit about how you're envisioning that mix as you look towards the future.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. And how inclusive is a channel if you're not able to use it, right? That's kind of the key message of some of the studies. And it's important to help provide access to credit and debit and other e-purchasing methods, having an on-ramp for people to be able to get into the banking system and payment system, that's where inclusion starts from our view. So different places around the world are solving these problems in different ways. An older example, and then I'll share a recent example, in Africa, when M-Pesa set up a peer-to-peer remittance and bill pay service, this was introduced in Kenya in 2007, and it spread rapidly. And by 2010, 68% of the Kenyan population had used this service. And then in 2019, another 2 million active customers joined. The early success was a parent company's decision to enable payments through a mix of digital channels. So consumers' mobile phones, of course, because there were some percentage of people who had mobile phones, through physical channels with agents stationed around the region who can actually pay out or take in deposits. So they still needed the ability to convert cash into some form of digital transaction. So recently, we served another need in Africa where there's, many people have mobile phones, and we enabled the ability for these users to register using biometrics to create an account, a digital account for them. And then we enabled that ATM channel served by that institution to then accept cash deposits, convert it into their account, and leverage that device to do those transactions. And then we allowed that financial history to build credit. So there was access then to loans and the ability to grow the business and have a history. And then another similar example in the Middle East, where the consumers wanted to be able to have a card that had an account number, but it wasn't a traditional card. And so again, we worked with a financial institution to enable really a private, non-gender specific engagement for banking. And we created kiosks where they were able to, again, use biometrics to establish an account, deposit cash, and then we produced an embossed card. So they were able to take that card and transact. So you had an account that you can do business mobily, and then of course, physically. And then in some cases, you still need that ability to be able to work with an agent to take cash and convert it, into a mobile payment if needed. So we're trying to think of every way for underbanked, unbanked, as well as, there's elderly population. I don't know about you, but my, father couldn't operate a mobile phone, and, trying to actually deposit checks and do things like that were difficult as well. And we find that some of the younger generation still wants that personal service of being able to interact with a human during transactions to help them where maybe they have questions or are concerned. So we'll continue to develop video capability to have that human-to-human interaction, even at an ATM device in a remote or rural area where they need assistance. So lots to do. Bridging this gap between physical and digital is still something that we need to be very thoughtful about, even as there's new forms of payment with digital and cryptocurrencies and things like that. So excited to have this dialogue.
Yeah, it seems like it's a complex ecosystem that isn't just going to be a switch.
Right.
A switch flipped. Does anybody else want to weigh in on that question before I shift us to a new topic? Oh, Jonathan, I see you opening your mouth. Yeah, there you go.
On the question of touch points, or
yeah, like human touch
yeah.
Versus all digital, and what that's going to look like as we move forward. Is there anything, I guess maybe for you, like, is there anything that is high human touch that we can't forget about as we shift to digital?
Yeah, one thing there that struck us in some of the work we did, and this was with the support of the MasterCard Foundation last 2 years ago, we kind of looked at the roles that platforms, particularly marketplace platforms, were playing in upskilling and helping their merchants along. And one of the things we found was that, and this was mostly in the sub-Saharan African context, but I take that back. We also looked at India, and we interviewed Amazon and a few other folks. But that it's not such a bright line, right? That is not the case that these marketplace platforms are entirely digital and you never get to talk to anybody. In fact, there's an incentive, although it's costly, for the platforms to help the merchants on the platform be better merchants, be better sellers. And that means that all around the world, various marketplace platforms are developing training offerings, what we call upskilling, in a variety of domains. I mean, they do digital literacy training, they do soft skills and sales approach, they do vocational specific training sometimes. If you're a platform for local trades and for carpentry, you may actually teach carpenters how to be better carpenters. And some of these actually teach financial literacy and financial skills as part of the offering that they offer to small businesses to help those small businesses prosper, and that's a win-win if they do it right. And then they can do that by a variety of methods. Sometimes it's face-to-face, the old, get people in a classroom and teach. And we've got an example of in this work with Uber in South Africa, partnering with Old Mutual, the financial services company, to train the partner drivers on Uber in kind of longer term investment or savings strategies and cash management and all, as part of the offering that Uber wanted so that the drivers would be more successful. But it doesn't have to be all human. It doesn't have to be in that classroom. You can do digital training and these great resources with like YouTube videos and hosted chats and resources that the platforms provide. You know, Facebook does a lot of this too with, you know, the Facebook for Business portal, right? There's a ton of stuff there. Or it can be, and this is the last thing I'll say, it can be right in the program itself, that the platforms can invest in making those systems, making those interfaces, ones that upskill through use and really train the merchants on things like visualizing their cash flow or visualizing their inventory. And you know, Jamia is using artificial intelligence to, you know, create a seller score that gives the small scale entrepreneur selling on Jamia a better indicator of how good that ad will be, right? And that's training, but it's not face-to-face training. So we don't necessarily have to lose, if we lose face-to-face, we don't lose training, but we have to think really hard about how to bring training into the digital world as well. And I think for financial services is a part of critical question.
Yeah, that's great. And I really appreciated that example of Uber, and who did you say the institution was, the FSP?
That was Old Mutual.
Uber and Old Mutual coming together. That's a nice example of a partnership, which to my question about who's better positioned, I think that's a really nice additional example building on what Yana shared too. Okay, I'd like to shift us now to doing a group exercise, and by group I mean everybody here. And then I've seen the Q&A blowing up and the chat as well, and I'm going to ask our Women's World Banking team to be on deck to put together some questions for us. But first, the group exercise. So let's put up the next poll. This is the part where all of you participate. And again, if you're multitasking, I'm just warning you, it's going to pop up on your screen. I would love for you to participate and answer this question. What do you think is the top pain point for women entrepreneurs to adopt digital finance? And there are probably other possible answers here, but I've put up a few. And they are: one, the lack of access to digital or brick and mortar access points; two, digital literacy; three, financial capability; four, friction between digital and cash; and then five, trust in financial institutions. And people are voting here. This is going to hopefully contribute to the next question that I ask of the whole panel and be a bit of a backgrounder that you can keep in mind as we move into the next panel. I see almost 70% of you have voted, so I'm going to keep this open for 10 more seconds as the rest of the votes trickle in here. Great. Fantastic. Thank you so much for participating. All right. So it looks like the critical majority of you, or at least the top chosen one here, was digital literacy, which is really interesting. And I'm hoping we can get into that in the next question. And then followed by friction between digital and cash, lack of access to physical access points, followed by trust in financial institutions and financial capability. This is so interesting, the digital literacy, because that is also what I expected it would be before going into this Mexico research. But as I explained, with this population we talked with, they were engaging digitally, but not shifting to digital finance. And that was the puzzle to me. This is, yeah, fascinating. So I'd love to now think about the customer journey, keep in mind those pain points. I'm going to experiment with Zoom here. And in real time, I'm going to turn on a whiteboard and I'm going to annotate this whiteboard in this next question. But so as you can see here, I've charted out a customer journey that's sort of an idealized customer journey. To Jonathan's point about e-commerce and social commerce being a little bit different. I think when I charted out this journey, I was specifically thinking about a social media company on which people are engaging in commerce. So the entrepreneur perhaps has or uses a mobile phone and has internet access. And there have been some comments in the chat about the importance of connectivity in the first place. So that's sort of a precursor. Then they start using digital platforms for marketing and communications in their business. And then they might shift to hearing their customers or suppliers demanding they take or use digital financial services. And this is, a possible journey, but there might be other things that drive them to digital. Then they start using digital financial services, and then ideally, they start using other financial services and not just payments, but rather it opens them up to engaging with other services. So my question for the panel is, what are the easiest steps here that just naturally happen and nobody needs to intervene? And what are the ones that are a little bit more tricky that as an industry we need to figure out? So I'd love to start actually with Yana, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot here, to share some insights about pieces of this customer journey. And then Jonathan, you're on deck.
Okay.
Or unmute, there you go.
So the idea here is to share where we think we can, what is exactly you want me to do? You are in mute, I think, Sonja.
Thank you. Yana, tell me, in this progression, what just naturally happens? Maybe that if people have a phone, they use Facebook. What naturally happens? And what are the trickier linkages that the industry might have to put more effort into encouraging? So maybe starting with the first question, what naturally happens from your perspective?
We are still, in Facebook, we are still developing many of our products in this financial/digital platforms space. But what we've seen so far is that how can we, there is an issue regarding trust, and that you mentioned before, and probably the trust would go perhaps in turning the use of digital platforms that is very common for communicating with customers. How can I make, or how can I translate this appetite into also wanting to enter the financial space through the same digital experience or through the same platform? So this is something that we are considering as we develop our products. And also what I would, so trust is something that is very interesting. There is also some, and back to my point that I made to Yasmin, there is also a great amount of work to be done as we enter into these heavy regulated spaces. It is not reasonable to think that digital platforms will have to have the same back office as a traditional financial institution. So how can we enter into a low risk space to make entrepreneurs use or make use of financial services in their common and day-to-day experiences with their customers? So there are some pain points that we need to address while we are developing our products. And to stick to your question, I would put as a question mark here, or as an attention point, the transition from step 2 to step 3. So how here, I think it's the one thing that we need to pay attention to. How can we translate those entrepreneurs that are already using our digital platforms to communicate with customers. They are already exchanging views. They are already selling their products and services through our platform. But how can they also convert this use of platforms into the financial services space? So my contribution here is, how can we build a solid bridge between the second step and the third step in the customer journey?
Thanks so much, Yana. Jonathan, I'm going to turn to you, and then Julie, I'm putting you on deck.
That's great. I mean, this is a great exercise. We could spend a very long time on it. So I'm going to be make some hard choices and only say two things. I'm going to say one universal thing and then one not so universal thing. So the universal thing, and the thing I want to point out as maybe being difficult, is that this entrepreneur starts using DFS step, which I think sometimes we take a little bit for granted, that particularly for women and particularly in household settings, that they have not only the sort of facility in the household to do it, but the external markers of identity and bank accounts or whatever to be able to start using DFS in the way that the business might want them to. In order to have a successful business, the more you can kind of control your own accounts, the better the business may do. And that, as KYC matches with identity challenges and all that, there, a lot of places continue to be difficulties to put the conditions in place such that if a woman in particular wants to start using DFS, that can happen in the way we want. And even Sonja, in your example earlier, there was the example of the husband with the cash card instead of the woman with her cash card, right? And that there's things to get right first. In some settings, having an identity sufficient, a digital identity sufficient to pass KYC, know your customer, so that you can enroll your own account, I think remains challenging, right? So at least to some, and particularly to the most vulnerable. So I think there's a universal challenge to get right about making sure the conditions are in place for to make that an option possible if a woman chooses to do so. Then my other point, which is completely different, is about how different this journey may look in 200 different countries, right? And this is because of Yana's point about the regulatory environment being different in so many different places, that in some markets, a WhatsApp or a Facebook or a Alipay or whatever, a WeChat, can act as the interface that's familiar to a customer or a user that then connects to a bank on the back end, is a different way to solve the financial inclusion challenge than Facebook or Alipay or Jumia or whatever acting as a bank, right? And actually having to have a license and all. And these aren't new questions for financial inclusion or for microfinance, but they've taken on this kind of new urgency as some of these things get solved by the digital platforms themselves. So I would say there isn't one WhatsApp offering. I mean, there are hundreds of flavors of WhatsApp offering, depending on what is permitted and possible and most effective in a given geography. And so the additional challenge I would put to that is the community on this call, and Women's World Banking in particular, can play a role in helping guide the policy community as to which of those types of WhatsApp manifestations might be the best ones for financial inclusion. I think that's an open question right now. I mean, it is certainly the case that the familiar interfaces for new smartphone users and for people who are just getting into the kind of digital realm are the things they use, not just for financial services, but for every part of their day. So the social platforms have a real leg up there. But what the back end looks like and what partnerships they need to do and how regulated they are is really an open question.
Great. Yeah, that's the second time that's been mentioned, is this policy and regulation piece, which might be a good entrance for Julie. Julie, let me turn to you.
Yeah, so to stick with that thread, because we can come back to the fact that we've got people that still don't have mobile phones and still, aren't being served. So, but to stick with this thread, I think that having multiple payments capability and options, and then trying to translate that into a credit history, to allow you to become a banking citizen and operate within the regulatory, if we extend the use case I talked about in the Middle East about onboarding and origination for a new account, maybe there's nothing to hold us back to collect some sort of opt-in during our, know your customer infrastructure. We can look at APIs, to plug in to get to full banking interfaces. Maybe during origination, I know there's some sort of credit score conducted. Can we find a way to create a new transaction history and purchase, patterns to give credit? I think this is where policy and inclusion need to come together to find a way, to provide an opportunity for anyone to be banked, and then to create that business value. So I think looking at the best vehicles to provide that access at the best rates, and to give the access to cash and credit is something we need to continue to work on. But I still think that we have so many people that either don't have a phone, don't have access, and we've got to continue to bridge that digital and physical challenge, even if it's through agents, even if it's through finding ways to take the mobile phones that are there and connecting it to retail establishments and creating an ability to transact at a place where cash can be taken in and given out. So a lot to think about on how to enable. So my point is, I think the challenge that Jonathan raised around entrepreneurs starts using the digital financial services is, a challenge for enabling a successful ongoing business.
Thank you so much, Julie. I'm continuing to type that up, but let me turn to Yasmin. There's still white space here for you, Yasmin.
Thanks. I know you want to make time for the audience Q&A. So I'll just briefly mention that for this customer journey, you had different personas that you presented, and CGAP's work also came up with various personas. Actually, we came up with 6. And on the one end of the spectrum, we had what we call digital newcomers. These are women who have a skill set, maybe they're good cooks, and someone convinces them, hey, you can make a business out of this. Let me, set up a WhatsApp group for you, or let me make you a Facebook page. And these women, for them, this customer journey is going to involve a lot of hand holding along every step of the way. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have a persona that we call the unexpected social sellers. These are women who are digital, media, social media savvy, they know how to use the different platforms, and maybe they made a sale once opportunistically, and they realized that this is something that they could get into more intentionally, and they leverage their digital skills for their entrepreneurship. So this is really going to depend on the type of entrepreneur we're engaging with, and the type of business that we're running.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The customer journey is going to look different depending on who it is, and designing for differences is critical. I mean, Julie mentioned the space for innovation in that digital adoption, and especially in the back end. And I imagine designing for differences in how people engage in their financial lives, and how digitally savvy they are is really critical here. This is great. I'm glad we're recording this so I can take a picture of this for a screen grab once we have a look at the recording. For now, I'm going to stop sharing and now turn to audience questions. So if I could put our team here on the spot and ask Jacqueline to come off mute and give us, if you could batch questions so we can make most efficient use of our time, that would be great. Give us some questions that have come up in the chat and the Q&A.
Absolutely, and the chat and Q&A have been incredibly rich with questions, so I'm going to try to synthesize a few. I'm just going to start with 3 that have come up in a few different contexts. So the first is, we've had a lot of people talking about the barriers that might prevent women from adopting these technologies. So we've seen mention of access and ability to buy smartphones versus USSD phones, internet connectivity, both in rural and urban areas, trust in these digital platforms, as well as digital financial capability. So if any of the speakers want to speak to how they've seen programs address these issues, that would be great. The second question is, how many of these barriers and opportunities are specific to women versus more gender neutral? There are a lot of questions about if these are the same barriers that might face male entrepreneurs and where are the specific challenges for women. And the third one, which came up in quite a number of ways, so I'll just kind of synthesize it to policy and regulation, especially with new entrants like fintechs or digital platforms. What's the role of regulators, and how can these different players interact with the policy environment that they're working in?
Sonja, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thanks. For the panelists, I'd love for you to raise your hand and let me know if you want to answer these questions. So first, the question about how many of these barriers we're talking about are specific to, or like how unique is this for women, this conversation versus for men? Anybody want to tackle that? Yasmin, you're up. And then on barriers specifically, I mean, there were a lot of barriers listed. We've already spent some time talking about barriers. Is there anybody who wants to take on that question? It might be a bit of a summary of what we've already talked about, but you can also add some new things. Anybody want to raise your hand for that question on barriers? Jonathan.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And then policy and regulation. Does anybody volunteer for that question? Yana. All right. Cool. Great. So let's, and then Julie, I'm going to ask you to just go off mute and weigh in on any of those that you want to, and I give you full permission as you will. So Yasmin, why don't you take that first one? How many of these barriers, or how much of this conversation that we've been having is specific to women, or is it pretty general for everybody?
Yeah, I think that, you know, if you solve these problems for women, those who are not women, you know, will also benefit necessarily. By designing for women, you're not necessarily, you know, excluding anyone else. I think, but what we've seen consistently is that women are systematically discriminated against when it comes to, you know, the pricing of phones. You know, perhaps it's consistently beyond their price points because they earn less, you know, and whatnot. When it comes to connectivity, you know, we find increasingly, you know, women having just lower access to data plans, you know, being in rural areas, that kind of a thing. Trust in particular is something that I think hits women very hard, because what we see consistently is that they don't feel as empowered to take on financial service providers. They don't feel heard by financial service providers individually or as a group, you know, if they take complaints. Now, I just want to take a brief moment to mention that, you know, when this barrier of trust in informal online commerce, you know, engaging digital fund, women are getting around that. The women that we spoke with, they engage extensively with their clients via messaging app to vet them, to make sure this is someone who's going to pay me, you know, this is someone who actually really wants to buy this product and isn't a competitor looking to rip off my design, you know, if it's customized embroidery or clothing or whatnot. And so they are finding ways to compensate for the lack of, you know, digital financial services, I think, can design for trust. They can design to create trust between the two people engaging in the transaction, whether that's creating a trail, creating a profile of the person you're sending the money to, you know, giving them a rating by the financial service provider, you know, whatever it might be. There are ways that you can design for trust in digital financial services. So far, women have been finding ways around that, but it would be great if providers could design for trust. And finally, on digital financial capability, I would recommend that everybody read all the wonderful publications out there on this. Finequity has recently come out with one, Women's World Banking as well, Center for Financial Inclusion. And we find that, you know, it's a challenge that women disproportionately suffer from, and how you how you design to overcome that needs to speak to women's realities. You know, it's not a one size fits all. I could say a lot about all the other topics, but I want to give a chance to the
we're running short on time, so I'm going to ask everybody else to keep it to 60 seconds. I'm so sorry, but Jonathan, Yasmin already got us started on like what are the solutions to these barriers listed, the smartphone versus USSD, internet trust, digital financial capability. What can you add here?
I think there's a lot. I think that I would sensitize people to the interplay between things that we can do to change individuals or wish individuals were different with changing the systems in which individuals are operating. And that the digital literacy thing, as useful as it is, and it is a barrier, isn't the only thing you can change. And that's a sort of, if only the person knew a little more, things would be better. You can change the system around the individual such that what is the easy thing to do and what is the safe thing to do is both, you know, easier to discern and easier to follow through innovations and business partnerships and better interfaces and all that kind of stuff, and the right regulations in place that isn't putting the onus of change on the individual, but changing the system around it is stuff that I think we need to be attentive to. And trust is that kind of marker between them. You don't necessarily need to convince people otherwise to trust something. But if you change the system so that the system is more trustworthy, you know, the trust and behaviors will follow a little bit. So it's not either or, you need to do both. But I would want to leave us with at least one eye on the kind of the ecosystem lens and the structural lens in which people have to make their decisions.
That's a great point. Yeah, what is around people sort of guides them to a particular action and also facilitates trust. Yana, let me turn to you. That question on policy and regulation, you started us down that road.
Okay, super. I mean, this is a very broad question, and far from giving you a recipe on how this should be done, I'm just sharing with you very broadly what we as F2 are doing. I truly believe that trust building is the name of the game here. So basically what we are doing, we are approaching regulators to share our vision on how we see ourselves in the financial services space and ask for their views as well. And with that, we begin a relation that will co-design, or perhaps that will give regulators or also a sort of an ownership on how we will establish F2 products in this specific market. It's totally true that reactions, openness, challenges, and opportunities vary from one market to another. But we are sure that to be successful in the long term in this space, we need to be in a balanced relation with a well-established regulatory perimeter, where both regulators and entrepreneurs and partners feel comfortable, or at least feel that the entrance in the market from an external player or unusual player such as a big tech or a digital platform is fair and is taken seriously. So that's how we are approaching the public policy and regulation space here in Latin America and throughout the world. And I think that that's the way forward. We don't have any more time, right? So because I was going to build upon other topics, but perhaps let's take it for another opportunity.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm also going to be reviewing these questions because there's a lot of richness here. Julie, let me turn to you for a 30-second last word, something you want to add.
I think we covered it. I do want to circle back, and we'll do so in the questions, on the people who really don't have access to phones, don't have the same equality of those capabilities, and make sure we address those areas that can help serve them so they can be banked and continue to do business. So I'll pay careful attention to the questions, and we'll contribute to responses.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, that's a great point. We want to make sure that technology doesn't move us into exacerbated or new inequalities. and make sure that infrastructure is still there for people who are not undertaking this customer journey. So thank you, panelists, so much for your contribution here. This was a very rich discussion. Thank you, all of you who attended. My key takeaway is this is an exciting time for this topic. We're still defining our terms and also making headway on addressing this market need. I'd love to turn it now over to Eleni Kyrou, Head of Representation to Ethiopia and the African Union at the European Investment Bank. Eleni, we leave you with the great responsibility of closing thoughts. And I apologize and thank you as well for closing our session. Thanks.
Thank you, Sonja, and thanks to all the panelists and a wonderful, a huge number, I would say, of participants. Both the discussion and the chat room were indeed, as others have commented, so rich. So my only privilege of being at the very end of this discussion is that I had the opportunity to just go between the chat and the Q&A and the discussion and try to capture everyone. Super rich. Thank you so much for being here. As the European Union's bank, the EIB has both digitalization and gender equality up there in its priorities. And we're not alone in that. So what I would like to give out as a message from the financial development, financial institutional community is that both these subjects are very much in our priorities, and we're not alone as well. Talking from my corner in the world in Addis Ababa, this is indeed the digital future is very much in the minds of everyone. The whole Africa is moving, the whole continent of Africa is moving towards a digital single market by 2030. And this is, in parallel going with the Continental Free Trade Agreement. So what we're seeing and what we heard described from all the panelists and the Women's World Banking colleagues is that the whole world is moving on this in this journey, and all of us, no matter which corner of the ecosystem we come from, we are very much on a fast-paced transitory journey, and whether it's regulation, whether it is simple plain infrastructure, whether it is affordability, all these issues are very, very real, and we're all trying to grapple and work with these things. I'd just like to finish with a few thoughts, particularly on what the bank, the European Investment Bank, how it approaches the whole rise of the digital economy and the digital future of across Africa. And this is a space where, very much thinking of some of the comments that I've seen on the chat, is a continent where, for example, as Julie mentioned with M-Pesa, we've seen huge growth in the telecom sector, precisely because of innovations such as M-Pesa in recent years. And in fact, Africa registered, global records in growth figures as far as this goes. But at the same time, across the continent, we have 900 million people that simply are not connected to the internet. We have stark digital divides. Be it rural, urban, and people have mentioned it, be it along gender lines. So what we're doing is very much focusing on infrastructure, and by infrastructure is not just putting up the towers, is also powering the towers. A lot of people who may have worked or are in Africa living, they know that access to power is major, is a major issue, and it does affect your connectivity very, very really. So what we're looking, and our approach is supporting universal access to affordable connectivity. Affordability is an issue, and participants have raised this also in the chat. Financial inclusion for the poorest is very much one of our drivers and one of our guiding principles. and also recognition of the importance of investing in digital services. So investment in broader ICT infrastructure development. And therein, there's a nuance as well that some of you have brought it up between innovation and entrepreneurship. And whilst we've been speaking a lot about entrepreneurship, we also need to boost innovation. Innovation and entrepreneurship go hand in hand. I'm very hopeful about all our efforts from across the ecosystem. There is a lot of coordination happening, and I very much look forward to following next steps in this discussion, hearing more, learning more. Thank you all very much for being here. It was a privilege to listen and to actually get to close the session. A very nice afternoon to those of you in the Eastern, in the Western Hemisphere, and a very good night to those of you in the West, in Asia and in Africa. Thank you all for attending. Session is closed. Good night.